Hello, they call me Indiana Jenkins. These passages to, not necessarily to prove the Bible.
Yes, actually, fun fact about Dr. Jenkins. So we would make jokes about him, being Indiana Jones and that sort of thing.
Eventually, we ended up actually finding stone vessels, and so
I'm a professor at Evangel University, and I teach mostly Old Testament classes, and when they let me, I teach archaeology here as well. I've been going to Israel since 1994, when I first started excavating, and I took quite a break, and I started excavating again in 2010, and I have pretty much been to Israel every summer since that, and I take students with me just to experience the joys of digging in Israel. How did I get started in archaeology? It's a long story, and part of it I trace back to a time when I was a student here at Evangel. I took an art history class. I was an art major when I started here, but I took this art history class, and it was the only class I ever took here at Evangel where I set the curve in it. And it's like it took no effort at all. It was just something about looking at old stuff. It just kind of stuck in my head, So fast forward to after I'm a graduate, I end up going to seminary, and in one of my classes in seminary, I was doing a Master of Divinity, but I took a class called Biblical Backgrounds, which is essentially history of the Bible, biblical history. And the man who was teaching it was an archaeologist digging at a place called Tel Batash, and we would know Tel Batash from the Bible as Timnah, biblical Timnah, where in the story of Samson, this is where his to-be wife was from. So it was in that process that I just became enamored with his sort of, the stories he would tell about archaeology, the slides that he would show. I ended up taking an archaeology class from him. And from that point on, when I decided to do a PhD, I decided to go down the same route that he did, which is biblical backgrounds and archaeology. So really what that degree is it's a degree about biblical history and archaeology. And it was during my doctoral studies that in 1994, for doctoral credit, I went to go dig with Baylor University at a place called Tel Machata, and its history from there, So I loved it. It absolutely got in my blood. I dreamed at that time that one day, when I was finally a professor, I could bring students over there and do the same thing. My expertise is in the Old Testament, and really, if you know much about Old Testament scholarship today, and I'm just talking about mainline scholarship, you would find that the history of what we read in the Bible is very much under fire, if it's even an issue at all to them anymore, because an awful lot of them believe that these stories that we read in the Bible are all made up. They never took place. So part of the allure of archaeology to me is to kind of study the background of these passages to not necessarily to prove the Bible, and this is a claim that you hear a lot, or at least what the average person who doesn't know much about biblical archaeology, they think that the point of it is to prove the Bible. And if you really stop and think about that statement, I mean, how could archaeology prove the Bible when, our belief in the Bible is based on faith claims? It's based on the fact that we know God exists, right? The fact that God has acted in miraculous ways throughout history to deliver his people, to even bring it into the New Testament, to bring salvation and healing and all of these things. these are faith claims, you know. I can't find anything digging in the dirt that's going to prove that any of that is true, right? I think what we can say is that we can, through archaeology, at many times, recover the background of what you're reading in the Bible to illustrate that these biblical writers knew what they were talking about, right? So it's not a fiction that was created later. It was something that was that the biblical authors believed to be true, and it is historical. So I said all that to say this, is I don't necessarily think the importance of archaeology is to prove the Bible, but on the other hand, it can certainly illuminate the historical background of the biblical material. What kind of evidence might we find, not necessarily to prove the Bible, but at least to illustrate the relevance and maybe the historical veracity of the biblical stories? I'm digging currently at a city called Shiloh. And I'll give you two stories real quick, okay? But I'm digging currently at the city of Shiloh, and if you know the book of 1 Samuel, you know that Shiloh, or Shiloh as most of us know it, was actually the place where the tabernacle, before there was a temple, there was this tented sanctuary that in Exodus they were told to build, and it had the Ark of the Covenant, and it had a few other items. But this is the place, Shiloh is the place where that tabernacle was supposed to have been. So in our excavations, just in the 2 years ago, in the 2018 excavation, they found this small pomegranate. And I know when you stop and think about that, it's like, well, so what? You know, pomegranates are indigenous to this area. But this little pomegranate had a little loop in it at the top, as if it were suspended from something. And if you know what the Levitical dress, the priests who were serving at the tabernacle, if you know anything about their garments, you know that suspended from their garments, it alternated between pomegranates and bells. So this type of item would have been something that would have been on the garment of the high priest. So it doesn't prove that there were high priests there. But what it does go a long way in doing is suggesting that essentially if a priest wore these and we find these here, you know, we might be safe in at least suggesting that there was priestly activity here. You know, so again, it doesn't prove the historicity, but it certainly strengthens it, right? The other example is I dug at the city of Gath, which was a Philistine city, and there we found what the excavators identified as a temple, and in the middle of this temple were two pillar bases where two columns would come up from that to support the roof. And the reason why that is so interesting is because if you know the story of Samson, obviously the final story of his life is where he's taken to not in Gath, but to the Philistine city, and he's placed between the two central columns, is kind of how the Bible describes it, and he puts his arms on both columns and he makes it fall down. So does this prove that the story of Samson is true? No, but what it does show is that the biblical writer was familiar with what a Philistine temple looked like. So we could at least say in this story that some of the detail that we see there is backed up by archaeological evidence. Well, what kind of evidence have I personally dug up? So at Gath, so I've got a few items right here that I'll just kind of show to you. And when we talk again about this atmosphere, about how some people think that the Bible is not true, the Philistines are a very unique people in the biblical story. Even though this little piece of pottery right here does not look important at all, this little piece of pottery tells a story right here. And this is actually called in very technical terms, Mycenaean 3C 1B pottery. And today that just gets too long and confusing to say, and they've downgraded that to Philistine 1. What we find is that the biblical story tells us that the Philistines had 5 cities. They were Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, where I was digging. And that's the biblical writer tells us that. And we know basically from the Bible what period they're coming into the land. We know where they originate from, according to Genesis. The island of Caphtor is what it said, which is Crete, it goes on to say. So basically what this is we find, now we've excavated at all of these cities, except for Gaza because there's a lot of turmoil there. But at all of these cities, right around 1200 BC, we start to see a new pottery come in. And this is evidence of the first one. This is the rim of what we would call a bell-shaped bowl. So basically it would have been about this big, and it would kind of come up in a bell shape. And so this is a bell-shaped bowl. So you find at all of these cities this style of pottery, Mycenaean 3C 1B, which is locally made, but the Mycenaean part of that, it means it's Greek. So the forerunners of this kind of pottery were made in Greece. So whoever came here and built these cities were using Greek pottery, especially from the area of the Aegean. So the point is this, is the biblical writer says these cities were Philistine, that they came from Crete right around this time period. And when we look at these 5 cities that the Bible identifies as being Philistine cities, we find a change in material culture, which shows that a new people group came in that fit the bill, right? So this is Philistine 1, and we characterize it by very thin, very well-made pottery. And you can't see it, I know, but right here is one little line of decoration. It's a little bit darker than the rest of it. That's Philistine 1, and then we go to what's called Philistine 2. And this was one color decoration. When we get to Philistine 2, they had 2 colors, this kind of, we call it red right here, and black. And so, even though, again, this seems very unimportant, this tells a story, and essentially it supports what the Bible tells us about the Philistines. I always joke in class, and they understand what I'm saying. Who would have thought it? The biblical writers knew what they were talking about, and the Philistines show us that we can see that the narrative that we see in the Bible is reliable. I brought a couple of other things here with me too. This is just kind of a what would you call it? Anecdotal, but so from the story of David and Goliath, it says that David picked up 5 smooth stones from the brook of Elah, right? So this takes place at a certain place in Israel, right at a city we know of as called Azekah. It's in the story. If you read it, you would see the city. So he's right there, but if you were to follow the brook of Elah for 7 miles, you'd come right out at Gath. So this is not from Azekah right there where the story takes place. This is 7 miles downstream. But I always like to joke and say, over the last 2,000 years, when waters come rushing through the brook of Elah, that these stones are rolling down, and I actually think that this stone was one of the ones that David rejected that finally made its way down to Gath. A couple of other things too. This is the only complete vessel that I have in my office, but this is what we call a juglet, and this dates from around 1000 to 800 BC, which in our biblical chronology would be roughly around the time of David and Solomon and shortly thereafter. But this would have been used as what we call a dipper juglet, and it probably would have been dipped down into a jug that looks an awfully lot like this one that had a little cup on the side of it, dipped down in there to get oil to fill their lamps and that kind of thing. So those were Old Testament, the things that I showed you, but this is a piece of Roman pottery. And so this would be around the time of Jesus. That this would have been very common, especially in the earlier Roman period. You see the very rough ridges. There's this old there's this old thing from Lay's potato chips, when it Ruffles potato chips, Ruffles has ridges. And so I always kind of pun off of that and say Roman has ridges, so when we see it, not that I want to take a bite of this, but this is a piece of Roman pottery. It would have been very common when Jesus was around. So. Why should people come with me? I think first off, I'd love for you to come with me just to experience what it is and to experience digging in Israel, stuff that has not seen the light of day for literally sometimes 3,000 years. I mean, it's just awe-inspiring to me, to sit there. Like when I pick up this piece of Philistine pottery that has been there since around 1200 BC, so we're talking about something that is over 3,000 years old, and to think that somebody touched this, maybe Goliath touched this, I don't know, right? But that's something we could muse about. But the bigger thing is, if you can't come dig with me, and it's a niche sort of thing. I mean, it's not for everybody. It's a lot of work. You move a lot of dirt. I've got some tools here. I call this a pastiche, and this is just a small hand pick. This is an archaeological hand pick, which, by the way, if you look underneath it, you can still see the dust of Israel caked on it, the of our haaretz, the dust of the land. And this is just another basic piece of equipment that we use. It's a trowel that you can buy from Marshalltown Trowels from their archaeology section. But we use these a lot. And essentially, you always see pictures and videos of people who have their little brushes and they're down in the dirt and looking right down there in the dirt, and that happens. There's no doubt about it. But what they don't show you in those pictures are the 3 or 4 feet of dirt that you have to remove to get to that point in what is like a 4.5 by 4.5 meter square. That's a lot of soil, right? So it's hard work. But having said that, I mean, if you can't come dig with me, certainly tour Israel, because you never read the Bible the same. After you've gone there, you've been to the places, after you've been to Shiloh with me, for instance, you'll never read the book of 1 Samuel in the same way again. You'll just be visualizing the whole time that you're there. And I tell this to people all the time who come with me, that it makes the Bible come alive in a way that it never has before. Because essentially, you're reading words on a page, you're just kind of imagining things and what it might have looked like, but now you can see it, and it makes it come alive. I think it's important for just Christians in general to realize that we can rely. I am unashamedly evangelical, and I believe that the stories that we read in the Bible are true. I think they're a lot more complex than we would think from just a cursory reading. But I think it's important for students, just so that they can go and not just students, but just Christians in general, just to go and kind of get a grasp on the historical reality of this period. At Shiloh, I've been digging to uncover at least in the last season I was there, to uncover the outward face of a fortification wall. It's about 15 feet thick, and it was actually built during the time of Abraham. I mean, we talk about the tabernacle, that's years and years later, but this is like back in Genesis that we're talking about right here. And for students, Christians, etc., to go and experience this, again, it makes these stories not just pop out of the page, but gives them a physical reality to what we're talking about here. So I think that would probably be what I would say are the two most important things.
My name is Isaiah Padgett. I'm currently a master's student at Assemblies of God Theological Seminary, but when I went on the archaeology trip, I was a bachelor's student at Evangel University. So I wanted to go on this archaeology trip to better immerse myself in the land of the Bible, a year before I had been to Israel, and I found that it really, enriched my faith. So when I heard that Dr. Jenkins was taking students to Shiloh, I basically said, sign me up. I want to go back again. So I hope to gain, more knowledge about the land of the Bible. I had always kind of had a fascination with archaeology, but never really knew a whole lot about it. Leading up to the trip, I actually took a course in archaeology with Dr. Jenkins. Was able to kind of get more of the knowledge of how it works. So being on this trip, I really wanted to, one, help grow my faith, but learn how we know more about the biblical context, the land of the Bible, and be able to, dig in person, kind of feel the soil in my hands. So I believe that the archaeology trip did change how I viewed the Bible. Prior to my first trip to Israel, I actually considered myself to be agnostic. And being in that land, being able to walk where the apostles walked, be able to walk where the prophets walked, and where Jesus himself walked, I found that it really enriched my faith. And going back to Israel, being able to participate in uncovering these sites and, trying to learn more about biblical history and the history of Israel, I found that it really did impact my understanding of not just the Bible and being able to place context and understand what events happened and the circumstances surrounding them, but it also enriched my own personal faith. So this archaeology trip changed my faith in substantial ways, I believe. Prior to that, I was indeed agnostic, and being able to see the sights, being able to breathe the air, the sort of physical, experiential parts of my faith, I found that it really enriched it. Prior to that, my faith was more in just head knowledge, just knowing things or just experiencing what I experienced in America. But being able to go to Israel, to walk where the biblical characters walked, to be able to dig in the ground and find these artifacts that link us to our faith, I found that it was a very enriching experience. For me personally, I found a piece of a column, actually, a Greco-Roman column. You can actually see a little bit of the ornamentation on it and some of the ridges of where it would have been at the top of the column. We also found coins. Those are pretty common finds, and of course pottery. Lots of pottery. In fact, a lot of it is actually discarded because there's so much of it, and some of it is not identifiable, so we only keep specific pieces that we know we can tie to specific time periods. So I actually got to bring some of it home with me, especially what we call potsherds. So they're pieces of broken pottery, and if the pottery is not identifiable, like we can't place it to a specific time period, it has to be discarded. So there's a lot of it in Israel. I was able to bring some of that home with me, some specifically from the site as well. I was also able to acquire a oil lamp, a Byzantine oil lamp, not from the site itself, but from an antiquities dealer in Israel. Asked if I would do this again, absolutely. It greatly impacted me personally, and it helped me grow more in my faith, but also find a personal element to my faith. So it wasn't just head knowledge. It wasn't just going to church every day. It was being able to be there and really find a connection to my faith. So yes, I would absolutely go again.
My name is Caleb Beck. I am a senior here at Evangel. I am a psychology major with a minor in biology. When I first had been asked if I wanted to go on this trip, my initial response wasn't to go for archaeology. But as I began to dive into it more, and talk with Dr. Jenkins about it, it really sparked my interest in the field. I didn't have a lot of experience or knowledge in the field, and so going on a trip was a new experience for me. I was open to learning new things and seeing what knowledge I could take away from that situation and see if I could use that possibly in other fields of science or I don't know. It was something that was really interesting to me that I hadn't really done before, and so that's probably the main reason why I wanted to go. So Dr. Jenkins himself was the first person who introduced me to the idea. And so whenever he first had mentioned archaeology to me, my initial response was like, well, I don't want to go dig in the dirt for all these 2 weeks that I was there. I actually was going to go for the culture more than the actual trip itself. But as I got there and as I got into it, every day as I progressed, I got more and more interested in it, and more interested into the technique and to the different styles and geographical locations that we were in, because I know that as I got out there, I learned that every location that we were in has different different types of pottery, different like eras of different things that we could dig up. And so it was very interesting to me. And even in, the 100 and whatever degree weather that we were in, it was exciting. And it really sparked my interest into it more. So every day I went out there, I just got more and more involved and wanted more and more from it. From the experience in Israel, I really wanted to get an idea of what the culture was like, which I did on the small days that I actually had free time to do. But the archaeology part itself, I wanted to gain knowledge in the field, and so that I could use that possibly later in my field. And I'm not sure if that's actually going to happen or not, but it is something that I now have in my mind that I do have knowledge about. And so when other people do come to me, it is something that I can bring forward and be able to hold my own in a conversation. And it hopefully sparks their interest as well. So yeah. I don't really know if it does directly, which is part of the reason why I was so interested in it. I like to branch out in terms of knowledge, and so archaeology in and of itself, I don't really think has a lot to do with psychology. I'm not really sure if you can apply it to that, but I'm sure there are different techniques that you could use. A possible example could be, psychologists like to think of how people thought before, like our time now as well. And so, thinking about how they were making certain things or why they made certain things is something that I could possibly use. But I haven't been able to dive much into that idea yet, but I hope to in the future. It did. It really strengthened my view because it provided evidence from things that I had already read. And so then after going on that trip and reading about those specific areas, especially the one that I was in Tel Shiloh, really strengthened my idea and belief that what it says is true. And being able to have that personal knowledge of being able to imagine them in their specific historical context really makes me want to read it more. And it makes me want to go on trips again.
What have been the basic reactions of students that I've taken? And they've been varied, to be honest. Now, if we were to go back to a previous question and say, do you feel like the Bible comes alive to you? All of them would say that, no doubt. As far as the work itself, opinion is divided. I mean, I've had students who thank me for the experience, and I'd ask them if they would ever come back. Say, no, I'm really glad I came, but I don't think I'd ever do it again. Again, because it's hard work. I've had students, and I always joke and say, I know within the first 20 minutes of the 2-week stint that they're there, I know in the first 20 minutes if they're gonna like this and be effective at it. And I've had some students that just are trying as hard as they can to come back with me, so again, it's kind of a niche trip, that we take. You got to want to do it and kind of like getting your hands dirty and sweaty and all of that kind of thing. But I had one student that went with me in the very first year that I took students in 2010 who came back with me the next year, came back on his own the year after that, ended up getting a master's in archaeology from a seminary, and ended up marrying one of the girls that came with us on that first one. But I mean, some people, it's just like me, it gets in their blood, and they absolutely loved their experience. And then if they can't go back, they're doing all they can to make sure they can go back again. So it's not for everybody, that's for sure. Okay. So what's a funny story that I can think of from the dig, from my times digging? I can think of a couple, but there's one that really sticks out, and I might actually have some video of this. But the guy when I was digging at Gath, the guy there was Gath was a huge area. There was at least 4 different areas around Gath being excavated at one time. I was in Area F. So Area F was way on top of the mound, and the gentleman who was what we call the area director was quite the jokester. But he's a professor at BYU, by the way. Especially at the Gath dig, it was very multicultural. A lot of Israelis involved, people from all over the globe were involved in that dig. So we had a BYU professor, Brigham Young University, who was over us. So my first year there, he always picks somebody because he does this every summer, but he always picks he picks a group that is there for the first time. So when we went, he picked on us. So we went off to there. We would go and eat breakfast at 10 o'clock or 10:30, I can't remember, and then we would come back. So we would be gone from our area for about 45 minutes to an hour. So we came back to start excavating after breakfast, and we're sitting there digging, and I can't remember if it was me or one of the students who were with me. We start to brush this, and we start to see gold, right? And I was suspicious immediately. Now, you ask them, they'll say no, that they got me, but they didn't, because I'm thinking, well, this looks odd, so, and look how easy the dirt's coming off of it, right? It's not all caked up. But we kept digging, and Jeff, our area director, is coming over, oh, what did you find? What did you find there? I don't know yet, so I keep doing it. If you've ever seen the Raiders of the Lost Ark, there is a couple of scenes. The first time we see this object is when we see Indiana Jones go to see his ex-woman at a bar that she owns, and she's got what he's calling the headpiece to the staff of Ra, right? So it's about this big, and what he had done is he had gone to Disney or whatever, I don't even know where he got it, but he bought a replica of that headpiece to the staff of Ra. It had kind of a jewel in the middle of it, and it was gold, and it had a thing, a hole, a shank, whatever you call it, to stick it on a staff. But he really kept building this up, and the funny thing is he was always playing music, like from his iPod or iPhone, whatever he had at the time, probably an iPod. But that day, it just happened to be playing the soundtrack to Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so he's making a big deal out of it. He takes the headpiece, he sticks it on a broom handle, and he's up there holding it like this, waiting for the sun. But it was hilarious. But he does this every year. And a couple of years later, and this is what I might have video of, it's not really good video, but he gets this girl who's an Israeli girl. She's Jewish anyway. She might have been a student at an American Jewish university, but written on there is the name of God, Yahweh. And when he's really building up, he says, I see letters on here. I see the Yod, I see a Hey, I see a Vav. So these are the first 3 letters of Yahweh. And as soon as he hit Vav, this girl starts crying. It's like, oh my gosh, I would feel terrible if I was him, right? But those are some pretty funny things that happen. We all get a big laugh except the one who gets the trick plate on him.
I've always liked Indiana Jones. I never quite knew how archaeologists felt about Indiana Jones prior to going to Israel. Originally, when the movie first came out, they weren't particularly happy about it. They felt it was more grave robbing depicted in the movie than anything. But over time, archaeologists kind of got with the joke, so you'll see a lot of them that wear the actual fedora hat. And I knew an archaeologist in Israel that actually brought a whip with him. So in a way, yes, it's kind of a running joke, but I find that it gives a little bit of inspiration.
So the funniest thing that happened to me on the trip was me and Dr. Jenkins had a running joke after a couple of days. So the first couple of days that we were there, I didn't have an eye for pottery or stone vessels as compared to just a normal rock. And so every once in a while, if I found something that was like smooth all around or looked like it might have had some sort of significance, I would give it to him. It was like, hey, is this pottery or something like that? And he'd usually just say, it's a rock. And so we had this running joke that every time we pick up something, we wouldn't even look at it anymore and be like, oh, it's a rock. It's a rock. And so eventually we ended up actually finding stone vessels. And so one of them that I had brought out, I was going to show it to him, and he's like, oh, it's a rock. And then I showed it to him, and he's like, actually, it is a rock. And so then we moved that over to our director, and it was one of the first stone vessels that we had found while we were out there. So it was really funny and interesting at the same time.
I do believe that archaeology is important for Christians in general. Even if archaeology can't necessarily prove things, that's not necessarily the goal of archaeology, I find that for many Christians, just being able to see that there's a tangible element to their faith really strengthens their faith, and it did so for me too. So I would honestly encourage many Christians to, explore archaeology, and if they feel so led, to even try and participate in a dig. There's a lot of great opportunities in Israel for volunteers to come out and help dig at these sites with their own hands. So if I were to give any advice, or perhaps a little bit of a sales pitch for going on a trip with Dr. Jenkins specifically, one, as just a professor and a person, he's really likable, really funny guy, and he's very knowledgeable too. I find that I can approach him with archaeology questions, and he just knows his stuff. He knows what he's talking about. Also, there's a lot of opportunities on this trip to kind of branch out and explore when we're not on the site, whether it be during the weekends or after the dig itself. I found that we were able to just wander around Jerusalem, explore, kind of get to visit famous sites. We went on Mount of Olives one day. It's quite the hike, but it's a great experience. So I would absolutely encourage anyone, new undergrad students or even current undergrad students, to really consider going on a trip with Dr. Jenkins. It's a great experience.
I think that it will progress our knowledge in certain areas, and I think that it's important for people of our day, especially philosophers and other people, regardless of your let me rephrase that. Regardless of your career path or your vocation, I think it is important to have some sort of mindset of the archaeology that is out there regardless of location, because I think that if you personally are a believer, if you're not a believer, if you are diving into knowledge, especially with a book that is talking so much about it, I think that it's important to go there and experience that for yourself, and to provide a baseline and evidence for what you believe. And I think that archaeology does a very good job at that. I think they should go to Israel to dig, for one, to experience the culture that's there. Two, to encourage their own beliefs. Three, to expand their knowledge in different areas, especially in archaeology, because I don't think a lot of students know much about it. And four, I think it really builds your faith. Because like I mentioned earlier, if you have a baseline and evidence for what you're believing, then your faith is strengthened. And I think that archaeology can really, really enhance that for students, especially at a college level. When students are trying to figure out what they believe, what they want to do with their lives, I think that archaeology can bring about that further, and it can strengthen your ideas and your beliefs in what you want to do and what you believe.
So how could you get a hold of us if this sounds very interesting to you and it sounds like something that you might like to do? You can contact Evangel University, or you can email me at jenkinsm@evangel.edu, and I would be more than happy to get back with you.